Welcome everyone to Fundamentals of Kabbalah and Chassidut. We are continuing our series that we only began last week on Maaseh Merkava, the workings of the chariot. From the text that we're using is the first chapter of the Book of Ezekiel. So if anyone wants to grab their Tanakh, their Bible, and open to the first chapter of Ezekiel. Last week, we did the first 3 verses. We went into great length and detail to understand the context of these mystical teachings. The first chapter of Ezekiel is the Haftorah for the holiday of Shavuot, and it's considered the most mystical chapter in the entire Bible, and a whole type of mystical learning called Maaseh Merkava is indicated, is explained, is described in this first chapter. We made a point of saying that the learning called Maaseh Merkava, the divine chariot, is not exclusive to this chapter. It's a type of learning that many of the prophets, many of the sages were able to comprehend, enter into in deep meditation. So we did the first 3 verses where Ezekiel in a certain way introduces himself and makes it clear that he's part of the exile of the people taken out of Israel towards Babylonia, in Ezekiel's case, 10 years before the destruction of the temple. And there, in the very first verse, he says that the heavens opened and he saw visions of God. We learned from Rashi is that the type of prophecy that he was experiencing was what's called unclear prophecy. It was through a clouded pane, different than Moshe Rabbeinu, who communicated with God through what was called a clear pane. And he also clarifies twice that he was on the river Kavar. So we're not going to go back. Everyone can access the first class on YouTube, on our website, on Telegram, and so everyone can catch up if you missed it. So we're starting in the 4th verse, and quite literally, we are going to spend the entire class on this one verse. It is that important. And just so people have an idea where we're going with this series of learning, tonight we'll do the 4th verse. Next week, we'll cover hopefully around 10 verses and the very, very important symbolic principles behind those 10 verses. The following week, we will finish the first chapter. As we will see, it's very complex, hard to understand, but we're going to give a general overview. And then after that, we'll spend a week or 2 or 3 delving deeper into the meaning of what Ezekiel is describing here, how it applies to us on a personal level. We'll see that even tonight. And the wider context, including what is written about Maaseh Merkava in the Talmud, in the Zohar. And that is where we're going with this series of classes. So for those who have their Bibles open, verse 4 says, Ve'ereh v'hinei ruach sa'ara ba min hatzafon. And I saw, and behold, a storm wind was coming from the north. Anan gadol, a great cloud. Ve'esh mit lakachat, and a flaming fire. The noga lo saviv, and an aura called a noga surrounding this vision he was having. Umitocha ke'ein hachashmal mitocha esh. And within these phenomena that he's experiencing, he's seeing, there is the appearance of what's called the hashmal within the fire. So there's really a lot to say about this, and especially we're going to be concentrating on the word hashmal. So let's go back, and there are 5 different things that Ezekiel is seeing. He's seeing a storm wind, a cloud, a flaming fire, an aura around it, a shining aura around it, and within it, the chashmal. So there's actually 5 different things he's seeing that will have a great significance. And so there's a lot to say. So I'm going to have to build on our understanding here. And so the question is, what exactly is he seeing? He's already told us that the heavens have opened up, and he's seeing visions of God. But then he's seeing this, it seems like physical phenomena, a storm wind and a cloud and fire and surrounding light and this mysterious hashmal in the middle. So we're going to start from the most simple understanding, and that's given over by Rashi and another commentary called the Mitzudat David. And I'll just say in general, the way it is described on the simple literal level is Ezekiel has already said he's among the Golah. He's in exile. And we discussed last week, how is it that a prophet who the general principle is only prophesying in Israel can be prophesying outside of Israel? And we answered that if a prophet starts to be a prophet in Israel, if he leaves Israel, he'll still have that ability. And so Ezekiel is prophesying outside of Israel, but the context is he's being taken unwillingly to Babylonia. So Rashi and the Mitzudat David and other commentaries explain that what he's seeing here, the storm wind, the cloud, the fire, all of this is representing the hard times that are about to come on Israel. Remember, this is approximately 10 years before the destruction of the temple. Not everyone has been taken into exile yet. Ezekiel is among the first to be taken into exile. And so the commentaries are saying that these descriptions of like cloudy, dark, a whirlwind and fire is all representing the destruction that is coming. Now, we know that from all the prophecies, excuse me, none of the so-called bad prophecies had to happen. If the people would have changed their ways, it wasn't inevitable. But nonetheless, the situation is very dire. And so that's what Ezekiel is seeing, according to the simple literal text. Now, there's a huge question with this kind of explanation, because right after this verse, Ezekiel, and we'll only get to it next week and the week after, starts seeing these mystical visions of angels and like a complex angelic world that he's describing in great detail. So the question is, well, how does that follow the idea that the cloud and the whirlwind and the fire is explaining that the terrible times are coming? It seems like it doesn't exactly fit into each other. Nonetheless, that is the majority of commentaries on explaining what Ezekiel is seeing and why he's seeing it. Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan has a completely different take on this. And he's very consistent with his methodology, where he explains here, and especially in his explanation of Sefer Yetzirah and the Bahir, is his claim, which is certainly based on tradition. It's not clear that what he's proposing is exclusive, but he says that all prophecy is preceded by a state of meditation, that the prophet, in a certain way, only can get into a prophetic state through meditation. And therefore, he describes, especially this verse, as those things that come to hamper a person's ability to meditate, the obstacles in coming to a state of openness and clearness and egolessness that would allow a person to have prophetic experience. And so he does the same in Sefer Yetzirah, where he describes the entire book as being instructions for meditation, different types of meditation, but in general, that instead of reading Sefer Yetzirah as a description of a certain reality, he reads it as its instruction to access this certain state of reality as described. And as I said, he's very, very consistent with how he describes things. So now let's go back and see how he is describing this whirlwind, the cloud, the fire, the surrounding light, and the hashmal. So the way he explains it is like this, and this appears to be the source for a concept, what's called klipot, shells or outer husks that hide light and holiness and positive energy. And in Kabbalah, it is explained that there are 3 levels of klipot that we cannot break through. And that is the basis of those things that are forbidden in Jewish law. Meaning we, at least in the present, we do not have the capability of extracting from certain things holiness. The example that is usually given is eating pork, is that everything has a spark of God in it or it can't exist. But there are certain things, all the different animals that we're not allowed to eat, the different birds or fish that we're not allowed to eat, we're told is because the klipa, the shells around the spark of God's energy that is there, we don't have the capability, and therefore they're forbidden. But then there's a fourth level of klipa called the noga, called klipat noga. And again, the first three are represented here by the whirlwind, the cloud, and the flaming fire. And this is consistent with what Kabbalah teaches, that there are three untouchable klipot. But then there's a fourth klipa called klipat noga. And this is the one that most of us deal with almost 24/7. In other words, klipa noga represents things that can go either way. In other words, they could be permitted, they could be forbidden. They could be within the realm of us fixing them and using them and incorporating them in our lives, and it would be a very positive thing. But then there's times that things close to this, we're still not able to do. And this we pointed out in a previous class on Shmuel, when one of the characters was called Naval. And his name actually means like disgusting, like really horrible, off limits. And it was pointed out that there's an expression that from the Ramban that a person can keep all the laws of the Torah and still be in this category of Naval Barishut. They can still take what's permitted and treat it in a terrible way. The example that we brought is eating. In other words, a person could wash their hands, say the blessings, eat kosher food, but eat like an animal, eat like a glutton, in not a like a beautiful way. So technically, he's not doing anything halachically wrong, but his behavior has fallen into the part of klipa noga that is not good. So here we have three klipot, and then we have klipa noga, and that's what we spend most of our lives trying to decide not only what is permitted and forbidden. The Torah tells us what's permitted and forbidden, but the way we go about things, that is in our hands. And therefore, we can do things in a positive, holy, beautiful way, or we could do permitted things in really not a nice way. A person could give charity and can do it with a big frown on their face and make the person feel like 2 inches tall. Well, he gave the charity, but they did it in a not acceptable way. So that's called klipat noga. And this is the source for it. This is the source for the three, call it untouchable klipot, and the klipat noga. So those are four klipot. And then in the middle was the hashmal. Now, what else does it say here? So actually, when I translated, I left this out by mistake. So it says again, and I saw, and behold, there was a whirlwind coming from the north. So this is a very, very important thing. Why does Yechezkel have to point out it came from the north? This comes from a prophecy that was granted to Jeremiah. When God first comes to Jeremiah, he tells him, I've appointed you as a prophet, and I will speak words to you, and you will go to the people. Jeremiah was fairly young at that point, and he was like many, many personalities. He was blown away that God would want him to be a leader or a prophet or a judge. And he's in a certain way saying, who am I? I'm not fitting. Very similar to Moshe Rabbeinu at the burning bush. And God has a lot of patience with Yirmiyahu and says, I will be with you. I will assure that everything will be okay with you, but I need you as my spokesperson. And so Jeremiah is still very doubtful. So God says, Jeremiah, what do you see? And Yirmiyahu says, I see an almond tree. And God says, very good, Yirmiyahu. Now, an almond tree is called a shkedia, from the word to quicken, because an almond tree is the first tree in Israel that blossoms in the spring. Actually, even in the winter, it already begins to blossom. So it's called like the quick blossoming tree, the shkedia. So God says, very good, Yirmiyahu. I will bring the prophecy that I will share with you very quickly, like this almond tree. And then he says, what else do you see? And Yirmiyahu looks. We assume he's just looking at what's around him. It must have been an almond tree. And he sees a pot, and it has a spout on it towards the north. And he says, I see a pot that is open to the north. And God says, very good, Yirmiyahu, because I will bring evil from the north. And so the commentaries say, again, with the literal translation that we discussed before about Rashi and Metzudah David, that here Ezekiel is being told that evil is coming from the north. Babylonia and the Kasdim, they are coming from the north. And in 10 years, they would destroy the temple and take almost all the Jews into exile. So that's one of the significance of the north. Now, going back to Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, so he explains that each one of these things is an obstacle to when a person wants to get into a meditative state. So the first level is the whirlwind. We all know that our minds are like all over the place. Now a person wants to sit in meditation. Well, it doesn't go like with the snap of the fingers that a person can just calm down and get into a meditative state. It just doesn't happen like that. So the first obstacle Aryeh Kaplan is explaining is, first, our minds are like a whirlwind. It's like our minds are all over the place. And then he says comes so he says that the north is always represented by Gevura. And here, the idea is, in order to enter into a meditative state, we have to apply Gevura to our minds. We have to set limits. We have to minimize what stimuli we're willing to take in. We have to focus, and focus is a result of applying Gevura to our inner beings. And so the cloud is also this idea of our minds are also cloudy. We want to focus. We want to be clear. So the cloud represents this like foggy kind of state of mind that we're in a lot of the time, that we're not focused and we're not clear. And then the flaming fire, as we start to get into a meditative state, then comes the fire. And the fire is we know that the way our brains work, our brains are an electric circuit. The synapses are sparking, quite literally, electrical charges. That's what thought is. On a biological level, our thought process is the sparking of our brain through these synapses. And so Rabbi Kaplan explains, let's say we've calmed down a little bit, we're getting more clear, but our minds are still running. And this is the level of now dealing with calming our thoughts down. And then comes, those are the three klipot that we have to get by until our mind's clear enough that we're in the area called noga, where we're in a place where we can start to really be open to a higher state of consciousness. Now, remember, I said we're going to go into great detail about this, no matter how long it takes. So now Rabbi Kaplan explains the following, that these three klipot, the whirlwind, the cloud, and the fire, represent three of the elements. The whirlwind, of course, is air. The cloud is water. And the fire is fire. And he explains that in the Sefer Yetzirah, when it's, and that's also, by the way, Sefer Yetzirah is very, very much in the tradition of what's called Maaseh Bereshit and Maaseh Merkava. That's what we pointed out last week, that the teachings called Maaseh Merkava precede Ezekiel by really thousands of years. It's just that he described it in a way that the name Maaseh Merkava became very associated with this first chapter of Ezekiel, but it's certainly not exclusive to it. So Rabbi Kaplan explains all of Sefer Yetzirah, where it says specifically that God created the world through these three elements of air, fire, and water. And he points out that earth is not mentioned. And his explanation from this is really very deep and profound, is that earth in Kabbalah is always associated with Malchut, the last of the Sphira. And Malchut is described as being a receiver, that it has, as it were, no energy of its own, but it takes all of the preceding Sphirot and then works with it and forms what we call Malchut. But it's a receiver, and that's why it's considered a feminine energy. And so Rabbi Kaplan points out that air, fire, and water, these are the elements with which God created the world. And the afar, the earth, is the receiver. And this makes really a lot of sense. And then he goes on and explains that the idea of afar, dust, that's what it says in the creation of mankind, that God took from the dust of the earth and he formed the human being. Here, dust means much more than the physical dust of the earth. It means that component of physicality that can receive the air, fire, and water and then do something with it. So this is also a very deep understanding. Now, I have to say here that when we try to understand, well, what is Maaseh Merkava? Like, what is it trying to teach us? We also have what's called Maaseh Bereshit, the workings of creation, the account of creation. So that is based on the 7 days of creation, is given over in the book of Genesis. And all of the all of the mysteries and the secrets and the deeper teachings of the divine creative process. That's what Maaseh Bereshit is. And why it's important is because we're created in the image of God. And the Talmud says clearly, just like God can create worlds, human beings can create worlds, meaning that we are in the image of God. We have a creative spark that can create incredible things. And we've seen in the last 200 years, or actually even less, this explosion of creative energy in technology, in medicine, transportation, communication, just across the board. And this is connected to what's called Maaseh Bereshit. By understanding God's creative process, we can then take those lessons and incorporate them into our own beings to bring out our creative process. So what's Maaseh Merkava? In a certain way, Maaseh Bereshit is the general overview of the creative process. Maaseh Merkava goes into the actual workings of how this world works. What's the mechanics? What are the principles? How does it all fit together? How do all the worlds fit together? How does physicality and spirituality work together? In a certain way, it's taking Maaseh Bereshit and going much deeper into it. And so here we can understand that Rabbi Kaplan is bringing the idea that what Ezekiel is experiencing are the three elements of creation. But here, they're in a certain way, they're coming as obstacles for his own mental and raising his soul consciousness to be able to be a fitting blessings for what he already said, that he was seeing visions of God. And here, Rabbi Kaplan is saying, this is how he is going to be able to incorporate it. Now, I want to give over my own idea here. And I think it works very, very well. As we said, there are five things that Ezekiel is experiencing in this one verse. And we know that there are five levels of the soul. And so in my mind, there's a very clear correspondence between each one of these phenomena and one of the levels of the soul. So I'll explain it fairly quickly. The first thing is the whirlwind. That is the air. And the whirlwind, so this is connected to breathing. And that's why we're told that when one wants to enter into a meditative state, this is taught over in Eastern meditation, but also in Jewish meditation. We've discussed this before, that it's very, very clear in ancient texts the importance of breathing and how that gets us in contact with God. Kol haneshama tehalelka hallelujah. The soul of every living thing should praise God. And the sages say, don't read it, Kol haneshama, every living being, read it, Kol neshima, with every breath we should give praises to God. Because the word for soul and breath are the same root, neshama, neshima. And the neshima is very connected to the body. And the level of soul connected to the body is the nefesh. And so the first obstacle that we have to overcome is connected to the body, connected to the nefesh. And then there was the cloud. And the cloud is the water. And our emotions are many times described in terms of water, because water is very fluid and our emotions are very fluid. They move very quickly. We can go from the highest high to the lowest low in a minute or less. In other words, our emotions are like water. So that is the ruach. And this is we start with a whirlwind, but that ruach leads us into the cloudy reality of our emotions, the ruach. Then the fire, this is the neshama. The neshama is called the intellect. And as I said before, we now know that the way the intellect works, quite literally, biologically, is through fire, electricity. And so that's the neshama, the fire. The noga, so again, this is the area where there's a mixture of permitted and forbidden, and that's where free will comes in. So this is the chaya of the soul. This is connected to the ratzon, to free will. And then the fifth element was the hashmal, and this is the highest. This represents, as we will see, the highest level of soul, called the yechida. Now, this whole description of Ezekiel is very, very close to the description of what happened to Eliyahu Navi when he fled from Achav and Isabel to the Sinai, because they wanted to kill all of the prophets. And he goes to Mount Sinai, and he is hiding there. And God is asking him, "What are you doing here, Eliyahu?" And he says, they're trying to kill me. The people of Israel have abrogated your covenant. And then it says that Eliyahu experienced a whirlwind, and he thought that God was in the whirlwind. But the text says, but God was not in the whirlwind. And then there was an earthquake, or at least the earth was quaking. And he thought, that must be the energy of God. But God was not in the earthquake. And then there was a fire, a blazing fire. Whether it was real or in his mind, it doesn't really matter. But the text describes that he experienced a fire, and he thought for sure God is in the fire. God was not in the fire. And then he heard kol demama daka, a small, silent voice, a thin, silent voice. And then he knew that God was in the voice, and he went out and God spoke with him. So this description is not exactly, it's not, here we have an earthquake, really, instead of the cloud. But the process is very similar here. It's very, very similar. And in hopefully tonight, we're just going to start getting to the most important part of this verse is the hashmal. And here, I just want to say a few other things before we get to the hashmal. Okay, we are ready now for the hashmal. So remember, that after experiencing the whirlwind, the cloud, the flaming fire, and the bright aura around it, then Ezekiel says, "Umitocha ke'ein hachashmal mitocha esh," that he saw within the fire the hue or the color of chashmal within the fire. So now we're going to enter into, and it's clear we will not finish today, but we'll begin it, the discussion of hashmal, what this word means and its importance. The word hashmal appears 3 times in the book of Ezekiel, here and 2 other times. We have to remember, we'll get to it, after this first chapter, it gets into the different prophecies of Ezekiel, and God speaking to him and directing him and warning him. In the 10th chapter, Ezekiel goes back to this vision, and we'll try to pick it up there also. And there, the chashmal is mentioned again. So it's mentioned 3 times in the book of Ezekiel. It doesn't appear any place else in the Bible. This is the only place. So what does this word mean? So here, when it says that within it, the ke'ein here is usually translated as a color. That the chashmal, what he saw, again, this hashmal was within the fire. So just like, and if any of you have my book on the lights of Hanukkah, where it's discussed the 5 different levels of a flame. If you look at a candle, so you'll see that from the wick, there is a black flame. Inside the black flame is actually a blue flame. Then you have the flame itself, and then you have the aura. That's kind of like the noga that is spreading from the fire. And so here we see that the flame has many different colors. And so here again, the literal meaning of chashmal is usually understood that Ezekiel saw a color, but it's very clear that this color is an energy. That's how it's really understood. It's an energy that is, as it were, translated into a color that he was seeing. In other words, colors themselves are bands of vibrations on the electromagnetic field spectrum. And each color is a different frequency of particles. So when you break down the colors, just like when you break down all matter is energy. So that's really what the hashmal is. And within this whole vision, he sees this energy called hashmal. Now, the sages tell us that hashmal can be understood by dividing between the syllables. Chash means silent. Mal means speaking. In other words, silence and speech. The sages continue, and they propose that the hashmal is actually a type of angel. And this type of angel is sometimes silent and sometimes speaking. And Rashi explains that when God is communicating with these angels, they are silent. When God isn't communicating with them, these angels are speaking praises of God. And so one of the explanations is hashmal is a type of angel. Now, starting when we get to the next verse, we'll see that this makes sense, because then Ezekiel goes into explanations of a whole different degrees of angels that he's seeing. And so here it makes sense that this hashmal that's within the fire is the introduction through which the rest of the vision is going to happen. Another explanation from the sages is that chashmal is like an acronym of 3 words: Chayot, Eish, Mimamalim. A type of angel called the Chayot, the living beings, that are fiery angels that are speaking. So if you look at the word Chayot, the Chet of Chayot is the first letter of hashmal. The Shin of hashmal is Eish, Chayot, Eish. And the Mal is Malalim, speaking. So that's, the sages say that this is like further, we'll call it proof that hashmal here is in the context of describing a certain type of angel. Now, again, that makes a lot of sense, because the very next verse, Ezekiel, and for the rest of the vision, he talks about, over and over, about the chayot, these living angels. That we'll get into much, much deeper. Here, this is an introduction to the whole concept of hashmal. So if hashmal is being described as silence and speaking, so immediately we see that there's somewhat of a paradoxical relation here, because silence and speech are opposites. Now, if what the sages say, sometimes they are silent and sometimes they are speaking, then there's no contradiction at all. But as we saw with Eliyahu Navi, he is experiencing in a certain way the hashmal, or this energy called hashmal, which is called Dmamad Daka, a thin, silent voice. And in Kabbalah, in Chassidut, they explain that it's not just sometimes you're silent and sometimes you're speaking, but it's the situation or the reality when they are simultaneous. And this is what's called the speaking silence. This, of course, was made famous by Simon and Garfunkel, the sounds of silence. But really, whether they did it consciously or unconsciously, they were picking up on these teachings. This happens that both of them are Jewish. It's possible that they were exposed in one way or another, but even not, the idea of the sounds of silence preceded Simon and Garfunkel literally by thousands of years, and are right here in the Bible. And so here we have that the chashmal represents the epitome of paradox. And that's why it's considered the most mysterious word in the entire Bible, because paradox is mysterious. And how to deal with paradox, how to understand paradox. And really, our whole lives are in the context of paradoxes that are somewhat beyond our ability to totally understand. Nonetheless, it's important to state that in Western thought, paradoxes are considered like scary, don't fit into logical thought, because a paradox means that, as the very, very important statement of sages, Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim chaim, two opposite statements that are mutually exclusive. So Western thought is, well, which one is right? Don't tell me they're both right, because they're totally opposite. They're exclusive. Jewish thought says these and these are the words of the living God. That paradoxes are there to, in a certain way, to be solved or to be lived with without them becoming a source of fear or misunderstanding. So this word hashmal is in Kabbalah and Chassidut becomes symbolic in a certain way of all paradoxes. And so this is something that we've discussed many times. And this is a statement in the Zohar that says, Bechia tekia beliba besitra da, v'chedva tekia beliba besitra da, that crying is wedged on one side of my heart, and laughing is wedged at the other side of my heart. So this is very much like the hashmal. There's a time to cry, and then there's a time to laugh or be joyous. That's not a paradox. Different times for different emotions. But Kabbalah and Chassidut explain, and this is one of my favorite teachings from Reb Shlomo, is that it's explained that we should be able to contain or hold both of these emotions simultaneously. The way that Reb Shlomo explained it is that when I look at the world and I see what a broken place it is, wars and sickness and hatred and oppression, how can I not be crying? How can I not be broken? But at the very same time, I look at the world and I see such beauty and such glory and good people and optimism. How can I not be joyous? And so Reb Shlomo also said that really we should be holding both of these states of mind simultaneously. And this is represented very, very much in breaking the glass at a wedding. And it just happened that last week I officiated at a wedding. And when it came time to do the breaking of the glass, which is the last thing of the wedding, and of course, a wedding is such a joyous event, but nonetheless, we break a glass at the end of the wedding to indicate that the world isn't fixed yet. We're still in exile. The temple has not been rebuilt. And we have to remember Jerusalem and the temple. And I explained that sometimes we do this at a wedding and we say the words and everything, but we're so wrapped up in the beauty and the joy of the wedding, we kind of do it by rote. And I explained, but remember, this was just 2 days before this war broke out. But I explained that considering since October 7th, this idea of breaking the glass is an everyday reality. We continue, and Israel survives, and in a certain way is thriving. But in all of our hearts, there is a constant broken glass. It was a very, very powerful experience. Very, very powerful experience. So again, hashmal represents all paradoxes. Okay, so I'm going to end with a teaching from the Baal Shem Tov, and we will pick up next week, continuing understanding hashmal, because this is one of the deepest parts of Maaseh Merkava. This is why it appears in Ezekiel 3 times, because this is one of the greatest secrets that we want to understand about life. So the Baal Shem Tov, he took the word hashmal and he explained in general. He said, anytime you have two opposites, there must be an intermediary that can bring them together. This is a major teaching of the Baal Shem Tov. For those who were part of our series on the Baal Shem Tov, we discussed this many, many times. And so the Baal Shem Tov said, instead of reading the word hashmal, we should read it hashmal mal. He introduced a middle mal. Now this works very good grammatically and linguistically, because the word mal means two different things. Mal means to separate, and specifically to circumcise. A circumcision in Hebrew is called brit milah, from the word mal, which means to circumcise, to cut off, to separate. And mal also means milah. A word in Hebrew is milah, to speak. Mi yimalel gevurot Hashem. Who will speak the praises, the greatness of God? We sing that at Hanukkah time. Mi yimalel gevurot Hashem. So the Baal Shem Tov inserts a second mal in between. And what he's trying to teach is that in order to bring opposites together, to solve paradox, you need this intermediary which can bring them together into the middle. Now, this goes back again to another series that we had about the Sefirot. And here again, we discussed at great length the structure of the Sefirot is a right column, a left column, and a middle column. And when you look at the structure of the Sefirot, it's a series of triangles where you have 2 points and they're brought together in the middle point, or 2 points and they're brought together in the middle point. This, of course, is the secret of the Magen David, the shield of David, 2 interlocked opposite triangles. So this is a great innovation of the Baal Shem Tov, and it's not exclusive for hashmal. He says it doesn't always work linguistically, but he's saying anytime you have opposites, you have to find the middle way. This is what the Rambam called the golden mean, the middle path. And as I said, this is the secret of the Sefirot, that it's 2 columns and brought together in the middle column. But this teaching of hashmal mal is connected to another teaching of the Baal Shem Tov. For those who followed the series on the Baal Shem Tov, this will be very familiar to you. And that is the Baal Shem Tov said that every process will go through 3 stages, every process in life, physical or spiritual. And he gave them names: Hachna'ah, which means submission; Havdalah, separation; and Hamtakah, sweetening. Hachna'ah, Havdalah, Hamtakah, submission, separating, sweetening. And it's explained like this. It's needs a lot of explanation, but the practical example that I use, and it's very real. And again, the Baal Shem Tov said every process whether it's material or spiritual, will go through this series of steps, this process. So when we want to accomplish something, so the first stage is submission. We have to submit our mind, our focus, our decision-making faculties to making this decision. In other words, many of us decide to do A, B, and C, and in the moment, we're determined. A minute later, a day later, a month later, we either forget it, we feel it was too, I don't know why we even decided this in the first place, we give up, whatever. So the first stage is submission. We have to submit ourselves to a task. And this is done through minimizing the ego and applying it to this task. The second stage is called separation. And this is where Havdalah, that we have this task now, we have this mission. And now we have to make decision after decision, what is going to help me get to accomplishing this mission, and what is going to take me away. This is called the process of birurim, of clarification. But it's also called separate. I have to separate those things that will just take me away from doing this. I have to move them to the side. I have to separate from them in order for me to accomplish. And the last stage is called hamtaka, sweetening. And that is when I am able to accomplish what I set out to do. But the two important things are, one is I feel good about it. How many times do we set a task for ourselves? Again, it could be a task that takes 10 minutes to do, but we're still going to have to go through the same process, or 10 months or 10 years. But when I get to the end, does it feel sweet? Is that what I wanted to accomplish? And we know that many times we put our effort into something and we don't like the final result, or the final results are just simply not what we had hoped they would be. And the second sweetening is the ability to thank Hashem for giving us the strength and the creativity and the energy to accomplish it, and not take all the credit for ourselves. That's actually a very bitter experience. I did it all. It's a very fake high. The greatest sweetening is to be able to thank God and realize, wow, God really helped me. That really feels good. So the Baal Shem Tov put these two processes together, hashmal mal and hachna'ah havdalah taka. So going back to hashmal, the hash, that's the submission. The silence is the silent determination to take upon myself this task. It's an inner determination, but it's silent. And the middle mal is exactly like separation. Just like in circumcision, we separate the foreskin. We literally cut it off. So we have to, hashmal, we have to cut off those things that will take us away from our goals. And lastly is the hamtaka, and that is the sweetness of being able to express our inner creativity, our inner mission in this world, our thanks to God. But these three stages of hashmal mal also speak very, very much for the process of meditation. At first, we enter into a state of meditation. It's the chash. We have to be able to get to that inner silence. We have to silence the mind. We have to silence the ego. We have to silence all of the stimuli bombarding us. And then the mal is, once we've begun that process, then we could do the serious work of focusing in and separate everything else out. We're going to be able to focus in on a mantra, a verse in the Torah, a word, a thought, a visualization, and we separate from everything else. And then the sweetening or the speaking is the actual higher state of consciousness that we could reach through that process. So we'll end the class with this. This was a good introduction to the hashmal, and also understanding the processes of meditation and thought process that goes into reaching higher levels of consciousness, as really described in verse 4 of chapter 1 of Ezekiel.